Hi, Alex. Great to see you. So just a little bit of background about you first. So I know you've studied and trained as a conservation biologist. You're in the field doing a lot of your own camera work and writing. And your work focuses on big cat conservation issues globally. Can you tell me a little bit of how did you get interested in big cats, and what sort of, I guess, sparked your interest in the natural world? Just to start at the very beginning.
Yeah, I was very lucky in that I got to study at a university pretty much coming straight out of high school. In the Southern Cape of South Africa, in a place called George, very small town that's nestled against the mountains, where there was actually a population of leopards and caracal. Caracal's a small sort of 10 to sort of 13 kilogram small felid that feeds mainly on rats. And there was this also a very small dwarf leopard population. The leopards in the Cape Fold Mountains are about sort of 25 to 45 kilograms in size, about half the size they are anywhere else on planet Earth. So I was basically at the age of 19 thrown into an environment that had these animals. So in the context of universities, there's very few places where someone would have that kind of opportunity to potentially do research on animals firsthand. So I was very lucky. And that's sort of how it all started. I started working on leopards there and caracals, and sort of just branched out later on.
Excellent. And you're a Nat Geo explorer. Can you, and that's how we got to know one another through National Geographic. But how did that connection start? And kind of how is your work and relationship with National Geographic? How is that kind of ongoing?
I got my break with Steve Winter. So he is the arguably one of the best, if not the best, big cat photographer at the magazine, in my opinion. He's definitely got the longest track record, done the most diverse stories in terms of the locations, the species that he's covered, snow leopards, mountain lions, tigers. He's about to start a story on Asiatic lions, and I've been very lucky to assist him and film him on a lot of these journeys throughout the globe. So that happened in 2012 was our first meeting, when I sort of guided him around when I was actually working on a research project on the Phinda Private Game Reserve. And then we kept in touch, and then I got to assist him on several stories pretty much from 2014 onwards. And it was through that relationship that I kind of got my first grant, my first television show with National Geographic Wild. It was pretty much through his connection. So it sort of shows the power of, who in the industry. And so that was the sort of relationship. And I've been sort of lucky to do both print, TV, and online with National Geographic over the last sort of 5 years.
Yeah, I mean, I think, mentors are incredibly important. I mean, is there something, what did you learn most from Steve, and that's kind of stayed with you and that you've, I guess, continued in your own work?
I just think that the biggest thing that I learned from him was understanding what it means to cover a story for a magazine like National Geographic, or in anything in its kind of broad, I would say, photographic kind of storytelling layout. In that, this is what I say to everyone: it's everything around the animal that you're photographing. So the biggest thing I'd say I learned from him was, the whole story of telling people and the problems and everything around the animal that you're focusing on. Same thing with when I assisted Charlie Hamilton James. A lot of the time that we were following either vultures or leopards or jaguars or whatever it was, most of the time was actually spent following people that have got contact with those animals, that are being exposed to conflict with those animals, that are being exposed to, having to live alongside the animals. And I think that's the kind of key, especially with a world that's, now got 8 billion people living in it, and so little habitat where these animals still actually live in the wild.
Yeah, and I think, I guess, where we came into contact with was on the Tree Climbing Lions project, which was a film that you made for National Geographic, for Nat Geo Wild back in 2018. And I guess, some of the things that you're kind of saying is so true of that film, and also, I guess, the legacy that still continues from that film. Because, I mean, you made it back in 2018, but I know last week for World Lion Day, you sort of post on Instagram the sort of story about Jake the lion, and I guess that film, that story, and the people involved is really kind of emblematic of, I guess, a lot of the challenges that lions are facing in the wild today. Can you just talk a little bit about, I guess, your experience on that film, but also, as you follow it and you've got the story of Jacob, just how it started and then kind of how it's evolved.
Yeah, so we were lucky that we actually got to tell the visual story of that also. So Return to Uganda, which was also an international sort of 43-minute, that came out, I think, about 4 days ago. I didn't even know it came out. But that basically is a revisitation for about 30 minutes of the show of the lions since 2018, what's happened. And that was really a documentation of Jacob, and also the new lions that are living in the same territory where the 8 lions that were poisoned in Queen Elizabeth, up in the north in the Kuseni area. So I think that's nice, because there's so few stories, I think, visually, both in print and video, that tell the kind of ongoing legacy of whatever's happening. In Uganda, it's quite tricky, because obviously with Queen Elizabeth, I think Queen Elizabeth, arguably in Africa, is probably the most difficult park for authorities to manage and to get really good conservation outcomes, because of the fact that you have so many people living inside the national park.
Yeah.
So you have a series of I think it's about 10 fishing villages dotted along the eastern and sort of western, the eastern flank of the national park, the western flank, sorry. And then you have farmers that are living also inside what is demarcated village land, but it's actually still technically, in all sense and purposes, national parkland. So you don't really have any boundaries. You don't have any, even in other East African ecosystems, generally, the communities live on the edge. Here you actually have them living inside the sort of spatial layout of the national park, which makes lion conservation very difficult, because the lions, and in the northern Kuseni area, that is the most sort of prime prey-rich area where lions are living, and you have about 3,000 cows between the Hamkungu, Kuseni, Yakatonzi villages. So that becomes a real challenge for how you manage the conflicts between lions that eat cows and villages that get pretty angry understandably, about the lions eating their cows. So it's been a real trip, sort of documenting that thing. And but obviously it's also difficult to document these things. And I think I would like to see, the visual arts really trying to tangibly help, from a conservation standpoint, the stories that they are documenting. I don't think that we are in a place currently where making films is good enough. It's yes, awareness building, but I just don't know empirically if we can show what a lot of these films are achieving, what a lot of these photographic stories are achieving. I think until we have some really good science-based evidence for that, I think we should strive as filmmakers and photographers to do more in helping the areas where we tell our stories.
Yeah, I mean, because I think I was struck with I think it was when you were filming that project, there was, there were the tragedy of the 11 cubs that were poisoned and killed.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that I think that struck me with what you said is, like, there are no villains. The reason that happened is, as you say, you've got people in the park whose livelihoods, when they don't have much money, and their cow is their livelihood, and the cows are eaten by the lion. There's no villains in this story, and I think,
well, I mean, it should be tempered. I think in an East African context, there should be a little clause there that they're not villains, but all cattle conflict is not as necessarily as it seems. So basically, cattle are often used as a tax trap. Cattle is the easiest way of storing value. And it actually turns out that in many national parks, or at least on the edge of them, it's not necessarily small farmers that own those cattle. It's actually sometimes big cattle barons that own them. And in that way, if a cattle baron does, if there is a retaliatory event, then jeepers. I mean, I find that more difficult to stomach as a conservation biologist, because it's not necessarily a poor person that owns those cows. And I think that then becomes an issue of what is it that is really valued in that landscape. Are we conserving cows, or are we conserving lions?
Which I think that's happened more. I know there's been issues in the Masai Mara where there's been instances of that happening, which again is presumably what you're kind of one of the issues that you're referring
to. And I think also we need to realize that the economic shocks of losing a cow are very different globally wherever carnivores live. So we're about to submit a big paper for review, a big sort of scientific analysis globally of where we've mapped how much people earn at the per capita household income level, where there are cows and where there are carnivores. And it turns out, as you would expect, that well-developed countries, on average, per capita, in terms of household income that is affected by a depredation event, they lose about 2% of their per capita income. If you look at transitional economies, it's about 8%. And in developing nations, it's about 25%. So the shock of losing a single 250 kilogram calf is about 10 times and 4 times respectively for developing and transitional economies, if you compare them to countries like Sweden, Germany, Poland. Well-developed economies do far better in the way that farmers can buffer themselves against losing a cow.
Yeah.
What's more devastating is that if you look at the African lion, more than 50% of its African range is in areas where people are very poor.
Yeah.
So these are real development issues that we as a society, that we as a species have to figure out solutions for. And I think that's very important, is sort of trying to drive home the message that a guy farming with cows in Florida is not the same guy farming with cows in Tanzania. These are two vastly different people, separated vastly by very different social safety nets, economic safety nets. And we as conservation biologists, as storytellers, as conservationists, have to figure out a way of how do we help those people that don't have those socioeconomic safety nets.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that strikes me is you studied as a wildlife biologist. You do your own camera work, and how do you balance kind of all of those skills in the stories that you're telling? And do you enjoy one thing more than the other, or is it a kind of, is the blend, something that really kind of excites you in terms of the way you tell stories?
I think, to be brutally honest, and I think if there's any young people watching this, I think it's very difficult to balance those two things effectively.
Yeah.
And you yourself will profess to the fact that opportunities for middlemen are getting more and more few and far between. I think it's important in a world of cineflexes, tracking shots, hyper time lapses, to try and be someone who does those two things efficiently. I would ask you, name on two hands who the people are that have the continuous economic opportunities to pursue both of those things. And I would say that I can think of maybe 3 or 4 people.
Yeah.
I do not know of anyone who is a well-published scientist, who is publishing in journals, doing quantitative socio-economic and biological conservation research, and getting films into National Geographic or Discovery Channel.
Yeah.
I think those are 2 very different worlds, and it's taken me 6 or 7 years to understand that the opportunities in each of those things, sort of as you progress down your career path, are very difficult. I do not think that there is a kumbaya, like it's a thing that works very well. I think that anyone who's doing those 2 things is going to have to choose one or the other at some point in their lives. So Tim Lehman is one that did it for a long time, but Tim basically gave up science. Tim is no longer a practicing conservation biologist. Yeah. Tim gave that up about 20 years ago. He now fully does photographic and video work for the BBC and National Geographic. Tom Peshak almost got a PhD. He dropped it, I think, 2 or 3 months before. And he fully went for the conservation photography side of things. I myself, I was kind of lucky that I, got 3 credits on 3 different National Geographic films and managed to do the science and get a PhD. But I think there are very few people that are actually operating cameras successfully, getting paid for it, and then doing science.
Yeah. So I guess with that in mind, but also, bearing in mind big cats are your passion, what's on your what's next for you? What are the projects that are on your wish list?
Yes, so I am going back to Uganda. I'm actually about to start a 2-year fellowship on conservation research that is focused very heavily more on intervention work, on monitoring conservation successes for all carnivores in Uganda. And it's been a difficult sort of journey, because I as much as I'd love to keep doing the film stuff, and maybe I'll try and pitch a few things to Nat Geo in the future, trying to continue along the smaller path of telling these more intimate stories around certain individuals. It is, as you said, it's becoming more and more difficult to pitch TV shows that are on a smaller level, especially if you competing against big production houses like Teramato or Silverback. These are fully fledged, production companies, with 100 paid staff. So it's very difficult to do that. I personally am of the ambition that I want to do more conservation intervention work that's firmly rooted in science. I don't think we have enough assessments of some of the interventions that we are doing in Africa and how that explicitly impacts lions, leopards, spotted hyenas on the ground.
Yeah.
And I think that that's very important. But my own journey over the next 2 years is very much going to be trying to pursue more of the intervention-based science, to try and help the existing NGOs on the ground in Uganda try and pull lions back out of the precarious state that they are in some of those national parks.
That's great. Well, I'll include a link, because I know that you're very active on Instagram, and it's a good way to continue to follow your work, Alex. So really thank you for the time today, and really good luck with your future projects, because they're incredibly important. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Can I just ask you